Since the announcement that Jared Leto was going to be appearing as Morbius in an upcoming Sony film, movie fans across the world have been asking the same question. Who the heck is Morbius? The short answer is that he's a vampire whose curse comes science rather than magic, who operates sometimes as a villain, sometimes as a hero, and often a bit of both. Beyond that simple concept, though, is a complicated character, a tormented soul seeking salvation, and blood. Here's the untold truth of Morbius, the living vampire. Blood-sucking fiend? Morbius tends to be a good guy by default these days, but when he first showed up in 1971's Amazing Spider-Man number 101, he was tragic and he was tormented, but there was no anti-hero nonsense going on. Morbius was a killer. That issue was memorable for a few reasons, most notably being that it was the first issue of the comic that wasn't written by Stan Lee. Roy Thomas took over writing duties, picking up on the cliffhanger ending where Peter Parker had 6 arms. Spider-Man sought out the Nobel Prize-winning Dr. Michael Morbius in hopes that he could find a cure, but instead found a blood-sucking vampire who looked like he raided the Bee Gees' wardrobe. Thomas considered Morbius to be a one-shot enemy for Spider-Man, but he also knew there was more to him than just simple supervillainy. As he said in a 2009 interview, both sides of him were always there. He was always supposed to be a fairly sympathetic character. Morbius versus the Code. The Comics Code was a self-imposed industry standard that, among other things, banned all representations of the undead starting in 1954. Some fans believed that Morbius was referred to as a living vampire as a sneaky way of getting around the Comics Code, and that his subsequent popularity helped break it down for good. His living status was Marvel's loophole, or so the legend told. The truth is that his creation was actually a response to the Comics Code having already loosened its rules about vampires, zombies, and other undead creatures. Since they were no longer restricted under the Code's old rules, Thomas and Lee considered using the most famous vampire of all and making Dracula the villain in Amazing Spider-Man number 101. Instead, Lee opted for a twist on the classic vampire as a costume supervillain. Although Marvel would launch Tomb of Dracula the following year, giving the original blood-sucking count a series that ran for 70 issues. Ironically, while Morbius's creation didn't create any friction with the Comics Code, another Marvel artist claimed to have locked horns with the Code over his work on the character years later. Penciler Ron Wagner worked on the first 14 issues of Morbius the Living Vampire, and in 1993 he told Wizard magazine he got in trouble with the Code for sexually explicit drawings in the comic. Operative word: living. While Morbius's living status wasn't meant to sneak around the Comics Code, it was an important aspect of his character if for no other reason than the fact that it allowed him to remain in the Marvel Universe far longer than his undead contemporaries. In 1983's Doctor Strange number 62, the Sorcerer Supreme famously used his magic to boost a magic spell called the Montesi Formula, killing Dracula along with every other vampire on Earth. Eventually, Dracula would make his return. Coming back from the dead is just what that dude does, but it would take a full decade. In the meantime, one vampire remained completely unaffected by any of it: our man Morbius. Because his condition had nothing to do with being bitten by some seductive undead temptress or stabbing a church, Doctor Strange's war on Dracula had no impact on Morbius, other than the fact that he probably had a lot more food available considering all the competition was dust. To infect or not to infect? Over the past few hundred years, people have defined vampirism pretty thoroughly, especially after Bram Stoker gave us all the blueprint in 1897. Morbius, on the other hand, is all over the place, including the question of whether his bites can create other vampires. Even when he drinks someone's blood, they only become vampires, like, sometimes. The first character he ever transformed was Jefferson Bolt in Marvel Team-Up number 3. Unlike traditional vampire spawn, Bolt retained his free will and intelligence, eventually turning on Morbius. More often than not, however, the living vampire's victims either die from the normal injuries you'd expect from having your neck snacked on, or survive them with the usual mundane consequences. Whether or not his abilities allow him to infect others has less to do with his condition, and way more to do with what's convenient for the story. A little help from my She-Hulk. One of the most important stories in Morbius's history, the tale that transformed him from a tragic villain into a dark hero, involved a weirdly violent court scene in the pages of Savage She-Hulk. Temporarily cured of his pseudo-vampire condition, Dr. Morbius was working on ways to help another character with an interesting blood-related problem, lawyer Jennifer Walters, whose gamma-powered blood transfusion from her cousin Bruce Banner turned her into the She-Hulk. While helping her, Morbius was arrested, and when Walters defended him during the trial, she used a bizarre method to protect her client. To prove Morbius was not in control of his actions while he was a vampire, Walters brought a pair of rabbits into the court and fed one of them the formula that had transformed him. Predictably, the rabbit immediately went full Holy Grail and killed its furry mate.
Jesus! I warned you!
Walters succeeded in getting Morbius's charges reduced, but the public wasn't happy. Right after the jury read its decision, her father told her he was ashamed of her, which might be even more painful than what happened to that poor rabbit. Story versus gory. When Morbius got his first shot at a solo title in 1992, it began with the creative team of Lynn Kaminsky and Ron Wagner. In spite of the passion Kaminsky felt for the project, his time on the title was short-lived. The reason? Apparently, he wrote too much story. Speaking to Back Issue magazine in 2009, Kaminsky described Morbius as one of his dream projects and said that he'd plotted 50 issues of the series when he started, including a crossover with Spider-Man and Venom. Unfortunately, he was fired from the book after only 8 issues. Kaminsky recalled that he wasn't sure why editor Bobby Chase fired him, but in a 1993 Wizard article, Ron Wagner said that he was tired of Kaminsky's character-driven stories, that he wanted more action and more gore, and that Chase agreed. When Wizard reached out to Kaminsky for comment, the writer said Wagner used to leave snide notes in the margins of Kaminsky's scripts, and that he tried to call Wagner to talk over changes but never got a response. Once Chase fired Kaminsky, colorist Gregory Wright gave Wagner the gorier scripts he wanted, for a little while. Wagner himself was gone from the book by number 14. Ultimate Morbius. When Jared Leto brings Morbius to the big screen, there's a chance he won't be a living vampire at all. Ultimate Spider-Man number 95 introduced an updated version of Morbius who had a much bigger connection to the vampires of his world than the regular Marvel Universe's version. He was a more traditional undead vampire who told Spider-Man he was the son of Dracula and spent his time hunting his brethren and operating as a villain. While Marvel officially put the nail in the Ultimate line's coffin in 2015, its impact on the film adaptations can't be ignored. A lot of what we've seen in the MCU was first seen in the Ultimate comics. Nick Fury was first drawn as Samuel L. Jackson in the Ultimate 6 years before the actor appeared as the S.H.I.E.L.D. director in Iron Man. Black Widow and Hawkeye being a part of the original Avengers lineup, Captain America's World War II-era uniform, the invading alien soldiers from the first Avengers film, and plenty of other visual elements seen in the movies were lifted from the Ultimate line. There's no reason to believe the Morbius filmmakers wouldn't learn from the MCU's example and draw on a much less complicated version of the character. Morbius versus Blade. Or not. While he never actually made it to the screen for a film adaptation, Leto's casting isn't the first time that Morbius has had a brush with Hollywood. In fact, if screenwriter David Goyer's original plan had been realized, the living vampire's first big screen appearance would likely have predated the MCU by 8 years. The DVD for 1998's Blade, written by Goyer, features a deleted scene in which a mysterious figure in a dark trench coat watches from a nearby rooftop as Blade and Karen emerge triumphant from their conflict with Lamagra. In 2016, David Goyer confirmed the figure was intended to be Morbius and, had he gone on to direct Blade 2, Morbius would have been the villain for the sequel. Instead, Guillermo del Toro directed Blade 2, and the story was altered to pit Blade against the Reapers instead. By the time Goyer directed Blade Trinity, the focus had shifted to Hannibal King and the spin-off-ready Night Stalkers. All 3 movies wound up featuring stone-cold evil bad guys, which makes sense since we all want to see Blade chop their heads off, but presenting a more tragic and sympathetic foe could have made for a very different, very interesting movie.